Welcome to the Unreal Podcast with your host, Darren Lindley. In the Unreal Podcast, we tell true and amazing stories that will change your life. Over the last 15 years, we've surveyed more than 100,000 people and written more than 240 books filled with remarkable, hope-inspiring stories. Listen each week as we bring you another incredible story. The Unreal Podcast is brought to you by booksbehindbars.net, a ministry dedicated to bringing the gospel to prisoners across America. The famous hymn, Amazing Grace, contains a line, "I once was lost, but now I'm found." This really says it all. In today's story, you will hear about a guy named Bear who was really lost. When his wife Kay finds Jesus, she prays one of the most unusual prayers I have ever heard. The process of Bear finding Jesus is one of the most touching and intriguing stories I've ever heard. This story was written by one of our magnificent writers, Marty Minchin. You will love the story, so let's get started. The Hornet's Nest. The story of Bear and Kay Francis, written by Marty Minchin and read by your host, Darren Lindley. My dad first noticed her sitting at the other end of the bar, a tiny thing wearing a white nurse's uniform. "Look at that girl over there," he said, nudging my shoulder. I turned my head to get a look, and I couldn't take my eyes off of her. I was wearing my dress blues, recently out of the Navy, on medical discharge after a mine exploded under our ship in the Gulf of Mexico. The explosion hurt my back, an injury that would haunt me for years. It was 1970, and back home on Long Island, New York, I hadn't found much else to do other than drive my dad to and from the bars at night. Tonight, Dad was right about the girl. She was really fine, and I wanted to get to know her. "I'll buy you a drink," I told her, "but first I have to follow my dad home and make sure he gets there safe. I'll be right back." I was thrilled that she was still at the bar when I returned. She told me she had a beautiful baby girl and was a war widow. We talked for hours. She whooped the tar out of me in a game of pool, but I blame it on all the alcohol I drank that night. The next morning, I woke up at home with a terrible headache and a piece of paper in my pocket. All that was written on it was Kay Francis and a phone number. I had no memory of meeting Kay Francis, but I was game for finding out who she was. 3 days later, I met the husband she had lied about not having. I ran him off, then moved in with her and bright-eyed 1-year-old Shaylin into a hotel room that was so small we had to climb over the playpen to get to the bathroom. I had a stable job, and I desperately wanted my own family. Now I had one. My dad came from a very large Polish family of mean alcoholics, and he was no exception. We lived on a dead-end street on Long Island, cut in half by a major highway. And everybody on my end knew everybody else. The kids played outside and nobody locked the doors. The neighbors knew how mean my dad was. They could hear him screaming, and our front yard was the battleground for his yelling fights with my mom. I was the oldest boy among 6 children, and my dad beat me every chance he could. If I was in bed when he came home at night, he'd call me downstairs, beat me, and send me back to my room. He had hands like iron, and when he hit me, it felt like a hammer slamming into my flesh. He never smiled. He never once told me he loved me. He mostly ranted and yelled, and my mother stayed out of his way. The pages of my school books were sometimes spattered with blood because he hit me on the back of my head so many times he opened wounds, angry that I couldn't remember the words on the pages. He didn't know it, but the reason I had trouble was because I was dyslexic and couldn't read. When I was 9 years old, I found our German across the street neighbor, Mr. Mueller, sitting in his red Chevrolet pickup outside my house. He was wearing his typical baseball cap, work shirt, and green khakis, and his leathery skin curved into a smile when he saw me. "Can I help you?" I asked through the open passenger window. "Climb in," he said, motioning for me to open the door. "I need some help. Go tell your mom you're going to work." So I did, and that was the beginning of the happiest part of my childhood. Mr. Mueller owned a dairy farm, and his 36 cows needed to be milked twice daily. He paid me $1 a day, and I worked for him from early in the morning until 10 or 11 at night, 7 days a week, whenever I could. I'd rather be anywhere than at home with my dad. At the farm, I learned how to take care of cows, clean stalls, and slaughter animals for meat. I operated tractors and balers, discs, and plows. And Mr. Mueller taught me how to drive that red truck I loved. At Christmas, he and his wife would give me shoes and clothes for work and school. Best of all, he told me all the time that I was doing a good job. I soaked up the compliments because I sure wasn't going to get any at home. Sometimes Ada, the Mueller's daughter, would take me to the Methodist church on Sundays. I wanted to know God, but it seemed like I could never get to know him personally like she did. My dad had a big garden, and he expected all of us to work in it. We never worked side by side in peace because my dad spent most of his time barking orders at us. After one day of enduring his non-stop hollering and screaming in the garden, I had all I could take. He raised his hand to strike me. But this time at 14, I stood up to him. "If you hit me again, I'm gonna take you out." I growled, my fist clenched into balls. I didn't want to hit my dad, but I didn't want to get beat anymore. We both dropped our arms, and I packed a bag and ran away from home. I lived under a bridge for a while and then stayed with some friends. Dad finally said he'd changed his ways, so I moved back home. But he just channeled his abuse into words instead of beatings. During that time, Dad did the one good thing he ever did for me. He taught me to be a carpenter, and I had the skills to later build my own house and a lifelong career for myself. When I got the letter from the Army saying I would be drafted for the Vietnam War, I went straight to the Navy recruiting office and signed up there instead. I was stationed in Panama City, Florida, working on minesweeps in the Gulf of Mexico. The explosion under my ship that fateful day threw me to the ground, and the blow was so hard that I couldn't walk for days. The Navy gave me shots of morphine to ease the pain, but the day I was discharged was the day I got my last shot. I took all kinds of painkillers when I got out, but they didn't seem to work. My personal pain management plan progressed to the point where I easily justified a little reefer here, a little snort there, telling myself it never hurt anybody. It numbed the searing pain in my back, and that's all that mattered. When Kay Francis and I married, 24 hours after she divorced her sorry husband and less than 2 years after we met, I was a drug addict. She didn't know it. We moved into a house around the corner from Kay Francis's grandmother, a spiritual woman who encouraged us to get involved in church. We gave it a half-hearted try, but we rarely attended a Sunday service. A year later, on Valentine's Day, we had our son Trey. I had already convinced Kay Francis' ex, who never had any interest in Shaylin, to sign papers to let me adopt her. I adored Shaylin, who had become my sidekick. Kay Francis worked nights, so Shaylin and I did everything together. We stayed up late and watched movies, then went out for breakfast in the morning. I loved this life with my family. The rare times we did go to the church that Kay Francis grew up in, I worried that I was so bad that the huge pipe organ would fall through the floor when I walked through the door. Besides, I was doing well enough on my own, and I didn't feel like I needed God in my life. Kay Francis finally convinced me to go one Easter Sunday, and I hesitantly took a seat on the pew. When the congregation stood to sing a hymn accompanied by that big pipe organ pounding out the melody, the booming sounds suddenly faded away. I could see people's mouths moving, but there was no noise in that church. My eyes were drawn to a stained glass window in the front of the church, which seemed to be shining with an unnaturally bright light. The window was a picture of Jesus, who was filled with light and surrounded by silence except for one clear sound. Jesus' voice was saying, "Look for..." It freaked me out. The sound swelled around me again as I looked around the church, but I had no idea what those words meant. I spent years trying to figure out what I was supposed to be looking for. A few years later, my wife's grandmother and uncle moved to New Mexico. We jumped at the opportunity to move into Grandma's house, not knowing that the house was targeted for previous drug activity. I was readily mistaken for Kay Francis's distant cousin. "You don't have to do anything," the stranger said. "I need to get this package to Smithtown, and I know Kay Francis works there. Just put it in the back seat and make sure she leaves the car doors open." I happily obliged. The drug run was surprisingly easy, as all I had to do was stash the package in Kay Francis's car and convince her not to lock the car doors. She unknowingly became my accomplice. When she went to work the night shift at Smithtown General Hospital, I'd put the drugs in her car and remind her to leave the car doors unlocked. When bunches of cash wrapped in newspaper periodically landed on my front lawn in payment, I knew I had found an easy way to support my own expensive drug habit. Even though this cousin was bad news, he and his buddies were in the mafia. It was a well-paying gig that was easy to hide from my wife. We did argue pretty often about why she shouldn't lock the doors, and I'd blow up at her sometimes when she'd done the laundry without telling me. She washed thousands of dollars of drugs that I'd stashed in my pants, cuffs, secret pockets, and hemlines. Construction was slow in the winter months, so I stayed home with the kids and dealt drugs while they napped and Kay Francis worked. But the easy money came to an end when I walked outside one Sunday morning with my cup of coffee. My blood ran cold when I saw Kay Francis's car. The hood was open and wires jutted out where they had been ripped from the motor. The boys, I found out, were very, very upset that Kay Francis had locked her car doors before going into the hospital, and they couldn't get into the car without breaking the windows. "If this happens again," one of the boys told me, "you won't like what happens to you." When my boss suggested that our construction crew move to Texas, I saw a great opportunity to get out of a town where nobody, especially my friends in the mafia, would know where I was. "Let's go," I called out toward my boss' house, the sun rising behind me over Long Island. The boys and I packed up all our stuff the night before, and we were there to load him up and get out of town. Kay Francis had quit her job, and we had rented our house out. We were ready to go. The boss cracked open his front door and stuck his head out. I forgot to tell you, boys, I'm not going after all." I slowly turned around to face the 5 guys in my crew, all looking right back at me. "What are you going to do, Bear?" one of them asked. "Me and the boys don't have jobs anymore." I didn't have to think twice about it and answer, "I'm going to Texas. You boys coming?" I knew I was going to get myself in a lot of trouble if I stayed. We drove out of New York pulling a 22-foot travel trailer with a line of vehicles traveling behind us. We'd park that trailer at night, and Kay Francis and her best friend who was moving with us would cook breakfast each morning for all of the guys and hand it to us out the door. 4 days later, our caravan motored through Houston before we found a campground in Magnolia, a town just north of the big city. The girls stayed there during the day while the guys looked for work. We had a hard time finding a footing in Texas. Sometimes contractors would rip us off and my crew would end up with $5 for a day's work. Finally, a general contractor saw my crew's talent. We became known as the hit and run crew because we could put up all the 2-inch woodwork for a 1,600 square foot house in 8 hours. A bare lot in the morning, when we left at night, a house frame would be standing. I soon got a job as a general contractor myself, working for a company. I directed a 53-man crew, and Kay Francis handled the paperwork. Being in charge meant I didn't have to work as much, giving me plenty of time to buy and sell drugs. Making up excuses to Kay Francis became a major pastime. When I had to explain why yet another weirdo was sitting on our front porch when we came home from the movies, I always told her it was something about a job. My appearances at home became rare. My kids would make snide remarks like, "Is that our daddy?" when I did grace the doorway. I was turning into my father, mean and aggressive. I carried a shotgun named Davy after Davy Crockett, and I readily used it to threaten anyone who owed me money. The arguments with Kay Francis about the laundry escalated, but she just figured it was because I came from an angry home. Drugs make you do stupid things, even using your own children to support your habit. In 1980, I had made enough money to buy a little ranch in Magnolia and stock it with animals. Shaylin loved animals, and we filled our ranch with cows, chickens, horses, and pigs. Shaylin helped me grow plants from seed, and together we planted a crop of healthy marijuana plants in the backyard. She would water those plants every night, and when I asked, she would till a little cow manure into the ground around them. When she wondered what they were, I told her they were odd-looking plants and I liked them. Kay Francis had mostly stayed away from drugs, and by now she knew I was selling and using. She never smoked herself, but if a bunch of us were in the van, she couldn't help getting high from the smoke from everyone else's joints. But one night on the porch swing, her curiosity got the best of her. "I'd like to take a toke of something myself," she said. Now, I didn't ever force Kay Francis into anything. Drugs take you somewhere you don't want to go and will make you do things you're not proud of. But that night, I rolled a joint just for her. She got a little hazy after a couple tokes, so I helped her to bed, stretched her arms down by her side, and tucked the blanket around her really tight. I thought she was going to sleep, so I never did loosen those blankets. Kay Francis, though, woke up feeling paralyzed. She couldn't move or talk. She said she felt like she was in a coffin, and she was so scared that after that night, she stayed away from drugs for good. Afraid that the people I worked with knew a little too much about my using and dealing drugs, I took a new job with a cabinet company that was 5 hours away. "I'm fixing to leave," I called out to Kay Francis one morning after I'd packed my truck. I kissed her and my 2 sweet children goodbye, told Kay Francis I loved her, and drove off into the dry Texas landscape. My weekday home would now be a barren motel room. Usually after work, I'd do some drugs in my room and go to sleep. One night, though, the guys gathered in the parking lot and asked me to come out and have some barbecue. We stood around outside smoking weed, the tiny lights from the ends of our joints shining in the twilight. The conversation went round and round, always about drugs. And when I met a woman at the party that night, drugs were all that were on my mind. She had a sizable stash, she promised, and I readily followed her back to her place around the corner to check it out. She pushed the door open, motioning to a trunk in the living room. "This is what you wanted to see," she said, clicking on the lights before slowly opening the lid. My eyes widened as I took in the trunk's contents. It was unbelievable. Color after color, packages, pills, needles, bottles, every kind of drug imaginable. There was cocaine, crack, pills, at least 10 pounds of weed. I felt like a fat kid in a candy store. This was life-changing. It only took a moment for me to decide this was what I wanted, these drugs, and this woman would give them to me. I didn't want my family anymore, or at least that's what I told them. Kay Frances heartbroken when I announced that I didn't love her and never had, the lies flowing off my lips before I had a chance to think about what I was saying. I did tell my children that I loved them, but that I had to go. I abandoned Kay Frances, our ranch, our family, and our life to move in with a stranger and her smorgasbord of drugs. The woman gave me full access to the trunk, and I stayed in a stupor for days and days, drifting along in such a haze that I couldn't even figure out what day it was, much less what I had done to my wife and children. While I was gone, Kay Frances came to one of the lowest points in her life and cried out to God for help. She accepted Jesus in her heart and became a Christian. She had cried and cried after I left so much that when she was finally empty of tears, she was filled up with God. If a church in town was holding a service, she and the kids were there. The Bible story she'd heard all her life came alive, and Kay Frances was suddenly so passionate about God that she was freaking out her patients and co-workers. When it was suggested that she quit her job, she did. She was so high on her relationship with God, she didn't care. And when our son Trey had a vision during a Pee-wee football game, it didn't much surprise Kay Frances. The kids were squared up on the line of scrimmage, helmet to helmet, staring each other down before the snap. Suddenly, Trey jumped up and ran off the field in tears, crying out for his mom. "Daddy's gonna die," he sobbed. "I saw Daddy, and he was in the hospital. He had a heart attack, and he's going to die." Kay Frances had no idea what was happening, but she believed that God had given Trey the vision as a warning of what was about to happen. She and Trey prayed right there, and when they said amen, they knew in their hearts that I may be in the hospital, but I was okay. The next day, a phone call confirmed the vision, so Trey and Kay Frances drove the 3 hours to the hospital. I saw Kay Frances and Trey in the hospital room, but I wasn't in my right mind. I had done so many drugs that I had suffered a nervous breakdown. The room seemed to be underwater with everyone moving and talking in slow motion. The woman was there, and for some reason, Kay Frances hugged her. "Take care of him," she said, and then added under her breath, "until I get him back." I felt tears on my face as I thought about the mess I had gotten myself into. I wanted to go home with Kay Frances and Trey, but I was shaky and scared at the ugliness of what I had done to her and afraid to talk to her about coming back. I was so sorry. And if my wife had just asked me to come with her, I would have jumped up and went. She didn't ask. Kay Frances and Trey walked out, leaving me there with the woman. They didn't know what the future would hold other than with certainty from God I wasn't going to die. When I recovered, the woman and I moved to California. I got a part-time job and fell right back into buying and selling drugs. Work wasn't that appealing, so we organized a huge bash on a mountainside near San Bernardino. This epic party would last for days, fueled by drugs and alcohol. When Kay Frances got home, she and her friends started to pray for me. Specifically, they prayed that I'd come home. Instead of things getting better, I had moved even farther away, all the way to Kimbark Mountain in California. Eventually, the Bible verse, Exodus 23:28, seemed to fit, and they prayed to God about it. "I will send the Hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way." Kay Frances saw those tribe names in that verse as representing the enemy that had taken me away. She knew for sure that God had given me to her, and she was going to pray me back home. She wanted me off the mountain and in Magnolia, even if it took a swarm of biblical hornets to get me back. We set up camp on the mountain on a cool California morning, and car after car followed behind us, full of people who filled our campsite. Someone lit a huge bonfire in the center of the party, and all around us people drank, smoked, and did drugs. Alcohol was my choice that day. I stored part of my stock in my truck, and at one point, I wandered over to fetch the fifth of Old Granddad out of my glove compartment and the case of beer that was on the ice in the toolbox. Not too eager to rejoin the party, I settled into the driver's seat, took a swig out of my bottle, and reached over for a beer, feeling satisfied with the massive bash outside. A weird buzzing sound outside interrupted my drunken relaxation. Through the windshield, I saw that the air was thick with black swarming insects that looked like bees. A huge cloud of buzzing bugs was headed right for me, and my truck windows were open. A few slipped into the cab as I frantically rolled up the windows and jammed the key into the ignition. I took off down the mountain, driving through a screaming, hollering crowd, running in the same direction. They grabbed the door handles, trying to get into the safety of the cab, but I pushed the accelerator a little harder and locked the doors. No way was I going to stop for any of these people. I left everyone there, including the woman. All I wanted was to get off that mountain and away from those bees.
Wow. Now that's what I call an answer to prayer. Have you ever heard anything like that? Bear's not out of the woods yet, though. We'll go back to the story in a minute. But first, I'd like to talk to you about what it feels like to be really lost like Bear is in this story. Sadly, this is not an uncommon experience. Most all of us have experienced the sense of not knowing where to turn. Years ago, my family and I were in Hungry Horse, Montana, where I was speaking at a youth camp. While touring Hungry Horse, we saw a maze. For some reason, that sounded fun. We paid the admission and went charging confidently into the maze. In a few short minutes, we were utterly lost. Every wall looked the same. We were all so very frustrated. After poking around the maze for about 30 minutes, every turn seemed to have the same dead end. Finally, we spotted an exit sign. It wasn't saying that we had completed the maze. No, we were just as lost, but we all decided we'd had enough of the randomness, and in frustration, we chose the easy way out. Our goal here at the Unreal Podcast and the goal of booksbehindbars.net is to help people out of the maze of life that can be so confusing. When we look at America's prisoners, we get a real sense of this utter feeling of lostness. They are stuck in a small cell because they have made many bad decisions. But the terrible reality is that just because they get out of that cell and release back into society does not increase the chance that they will find life, peace, and purpose. When we send stories like this one in book form into prison, they get an opportunity to see that there is a way, the way, Jesus Christ. Would you help us bring this good news to prisoners across this country who are dying in prison because they simply need to be rescued just like Bear? When you become a sponsor and begin the monthly process of sending books to prison, you are opening the exit door for these lost men and women. While they won't necessarily get out of their prison cell, they will find the hope and purpose that only Jesus can bring. Would you prayerfully consider going to booksbehindbars.net and clicking the donate button? Think about sending 5 books a month or more to prison. We have a generous donor who is excited about this podcast and the ministry of booksbehindbars.net. He believes that we all could make a massive difference in the lives of many thousands of people with these books. That's why he has committed to getting this podcast off to a great start by matching the donations of every person who commits to sponsoring 5 books or more per month. While there's no minimum quantity and no minimum duration to your sponsorship, he will match any donation of 5 books per month or more for the life of your donation. This generous offer expires on December 31st, 2019. Please go to booksbehindbars.net now and click the donate button. There are so many prisoners who will continue to wander without any hope of finding purpose or peace and will certainly offend again without it. Please join us today at booksbehindbars.net. Now, let's get back to the Hornet's Nest, the story of Bear and Kay Francis.
When I got to the base, far ahead of the runners and the insects, I felt like a lot of things had been lifted off my mind. Life, for the moment, seemed a little clearer. Maybe I thought, I'll call home and see how the kids are doing. I'm getting tired, I told Kay Francis. I just want to come and see the kids for a little bit. I got in my truck and drove for 3 days, working through most of the beer, the old granddad, and the 3 packs of reefers in my truck along the way. As I neared Magnolia, the sun rising over the horizon, I hummed along to one of my favorite songs, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree, when it came on the radio. I pulled up at the ranch Easter Sunday morning. Wouldn't you know, anticipating my return, Kay Francis had tied yellow ribbons around at least 40 oak trees in our front yard. When she and the kids walked outside to meet me, it felt like nothing had changed, like I was coming up the driveway after a day at work. It felt good to be home, so good that Kay Francis easily talked me into going to church with her that morning. I would have done anything to stick around a little longer. I was now seeing Kay Francis and the kids with a clear head, and I realized that I was losing. My old life seemed to be waiting for me inside the house. My place on the table was set, my clothes in my dresser drawers. Trey and Shaylin jumped around in excitement because we were going to church as a family of 4. Church didn't do much for me that morning. Everywhere I looked, I felt bad. 5 or 6 boys I used to sell drugs to sat in the pews ahead of us with their wives, and I thought about how I ruined all of these lives. I felt so dirty that I couldn't even look at Kay Francis half the time. "Why don't you stay for a couple of days?" Kay Francis asked when we got home. I agreed to it. "Let's get whatever you have out of the truck and clean it out," she said. "You've had a long trip." I headed straight to the glove compartment to finish off the last of the bourbon. My reefer was gone, and I only had a couple of beers left in the toolbox. I needed to get to a store to replenish my supply, but I couldn't leave. My kids danced around saying, "Daddy's home, Daddy's home," over and over, and I didn't want to leave them quite yet, even for a few minutes. "What's this?" Kay Francis demanded, backing out of the cab of the truck, holding out her hand, palm up. I grabbed her hand and examined the dead bug on it. "That's a hornet," I told her. "Where did it come from?" Her voice pitched higher and louder. "Are you sure it's a hornet?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, wondering why she was making such a big deal over a dead bug in a truck. "I know hornets, wasps, bees, yellow jackets. It's a hornet, all right. I just don't know how it got in the truck because I thought I got rid of them all." "What do you mean?" Kay Francis asked slowly, her eyes boring into me. "We were having a party, and it seemed like this herd of bees came from nowhere." Any more details of my story were lost because Kay Francis had turned into a screaming, dancing fool. I know even the neighbors heard her yelling and praising the Lord. I couldn't for the life of me figure out what was going on. Finally, I got her calmed down enough to explain. She told me she and our neighbor had been praying that God would send a swarm of hornets to run me off a mountain right back home. Finally, I got her calmed down enough to explain. She told me that she and our neighbors had been praying that God would send a swarm of hornets to run me off a mountain and right back home. "I knew that God was going to bring you back, period. End of the story," she said, tears shining in her eyes. I just didn't know when or how it would happen. "You really believe that stuff, huh?" I asked her. She nodded enthusiastically. "Well, God hasn't made a believer out of me because I don't see it myself." I woke up at 2 a.m. sweating and shaking like a leaf. The sheets were soaked. Kay Francis had invited me to sleep in our bed, and I had found some pajamas right where they belonged in the dresser. The pain was sweeping through my back. I hadn't drunk or smoked anything since the afternoon before. "Kay Francis, I've got to have something now," I whispered. "I'll go to the kitchen and see what I have." She returned with a water glass filled with bourbon. "I don't even know where this came from," she said, putting the glass into my trembling hands. Her willingness to serve me alcohol surprised me, but I was so happy to see that drink that I didn't care where it had come from. "Do you mind if I pray for you?" Kay Francis asked. "As long as you don't stop me from drinking." She started praying, and I tipped that glass to my mouth and started drinking. With that first mouthful of fiery liquid, I could feel my body relax. I drank and drank while Kay Francis prayed, and when the glass was empty, I looked over at Kay Francis and hardly recognized her. She was standing on the bed, an angel in white, praying in a language I didn't understand. Maybe I'm really messed up tonight, but I don't care. I got what I wanted. On a normal morning, I would wake up, hit the alarm off, and unscrew the bottle by my bed. I'd usually take a few drinks before my feet were firm on the floor, and then I'd go outside to cough. My lungs were terrible from years of smoking cigarettes, and it was exhausting to start every day practically hacking up a lung. Every winter without fail, I got at least one case of pneumonia. The day after Kay Francis prayed, I woke up to a rich coffee smell floating through the house. Instead of reaching for a bottle, I walked into the kitchen and enjoyed a cup of coffee with my wife. Kay Francis' prayers had delivered me from alcohol. That day I started a new life, and I never touched alcohol again. God was trying to show himself to me, yet I wasn't quite ready for him. A few days at home stretched out into months. The neighbors, who had prayed the Hornet prayer with Kay Francis, invited us to their church for a remarriage ceremony, and we renewed our vows. An altar call followed, and Kay Francis went forward because she wanted the pastor to pray for her eyes. She was born cross-eyed. Doctors overcorrected during the surgery, and one eye looked up and one looked out. It had been a lifelong insecurity for her. I wanted God to help Kay Francis with her eyes, so I slid out of the pew and followed her to the front of the church. I prayed so hard, begging God to do whatever he could do for her. My prayers were so intense that I slipped into another language, a special prayer language that I didn't even know was possible. God filled me with the Holy Spirit that night, and I prayed for almost an hour, even though it seemed like only 30 seconds to me. After that night, I started to get serious about God. He delivered me from alcohol and filled me with his Spirit, but I hadn't let go of the drugs and cigarettes. It was time for me to give up smoking, but I needed God's help. Kay Francis and I decided to move back to New York so that our children could get to know their grandparents. When the girl who offered to buy our house in Magnolia backed out at the last minute, we ended up spending our last days in Texas in a freezing, empty house with hardly any furniture. We pushed blankets against the doors and windows to keep out the cold and camped in the living room. We cooked on a Ben Franklin stove and listened to the radio, our only form of entertainment. One day, that radio delivered the message that would be the answer to my prayers about cigarettes. A country church was holding a healing and deliverance service that night. I decided that I needed to go, and I needed to be the first in line for prayer. If I don't go and get prayed for first, it's not going to happen. I told my family as we wrestled around on the living room floor. I need all the power that boy's got. Trey jumped on the back of my neck. Dad, you don't have to be first. I pulled him around to face me. Yes, I do. I was a big man, and it was going to take a lot of power to pray the desire for cigarettes out of me. That evening, I set my cigarettes and 24-karat gold Zippo lighter on the coffee table in the living room because if I was going to be delivered, I wouldn't need them anymore. Kay Francis and I climbed into the truck and headed out to pick up my buddy, who also smoked, who wanted to attend the service. It was a chaos at his house. He wasn't ready, his kids were running around everywhere, and we were very late. He was sure he knew where the church was, but he ended up in a cow pasture. Luckily, the church was just around the corner in another cow pasture. We had to pick our way around cow patties to get to the door. My heart sank when we reached the building. The church was so packed that the only seats left were chairs lined up along the back wall. I could hardly see the stage, which was at least 50 feet wide. The pastor looked like an ant standing on it. This is no way to treat somebody who's here to get his healing first, I fumed to myself, folded my arms. Between my attitude and my big chip on my shoulder, my frustration was clear. The service went on in spite of my temper tantrum, which the pastor probably didn't notice, and before he could even begin the altar call, people were tossing cigarettes and lighters at him. My anger burned hotter because I had left mine at home. How am I supposed to be delivered from stuff I didn't even have with me? When I looked up, the pastor had walked into the crowd and was engulfed in the hundreds of people wanting to be near him. I couldn't even see the stage anymore. It's not my time, I told Kay Francis. I'm not going to go. If I can't be first, I'm not going. Oh, yes, you are. Kay Francis had no intention of leaving. Oh, no, I'm not. The music stopped, the sudden silence ending our squabble. It was so quiet, I thought someone had gotten hurt. The pastor climbed back on stage and grabbed his microphone. When God tells you to do something, you just got to do it, he announced. God told me just now, standing right down there in the crowd, that I got to pray for some man first. That got my attention. I don't know who this guy is, but God told me you and him got a lot in common. You're both carpenters. I don't have enough power to deliver you from what it is you need deliverance from. There's something to do with wood, and that's your bond. I need some wood, he called out, and the drummer from the praise band leapt up and offered the pastor his wooden drumsticks. I'm going to break them. The pastor held the drumsticks above his head and somehow snapped them in two. Then he pointed at me, way back in the crowd. Sir, God wants me to pray for you first. That's when I knew God was real. My wife saw all this happen. She heard me telling everybody I had to be first. I couldn't see that pastor yet. He picked me out of a crowd. We wove through the crowd to the front. And when the pastor laid his hand on me and started praying, a warmth came over me that seemed to rub me all over inside, scrubbing my lungs and my heart. I was so thankful, and I felt certain I was healed that night. We had a great discussion with the pastor after the service, and I got a new Bible. I never coughed again or got pneumonia. And that lighter and cigarettes sat on the coffee table until we moved. We threw it all away on the way out the door. We lasted 3 months in New York. We had become laid-back Texans, which didn't mesh well with our New York family. Everything was expensive, and when a deal to buy a piece of property fell through, we headed back west, stopping in Louisiana, where some old drug buddies of mine lived. We stayed for 3 years. While God had delivered me from cigarettes and alcohol, I still had back pain and took drugs to alleviate it. After 2 years, I found a job back in Texas. Kay Francis decided to stay in Louisiana 1 more year so that Shaylin could finish high school. The day after Shaylin's graduation, Kay Francis and the kids packed the car to join me in Texas. I had moved back into the same mobile home where my weird drug acquaintances used to wait on the front porch, and after a year as a bachelor, I had become accustomed to living by myself. My old friends had stirred up all kinds of lies and trouble, and when Kay Francis arrived, it was like she had stepped on another hornet's nest. It put a terrible strain on our marriage. Finally, Kay Francis had enough. "Devil!" she screamed one afternoon, looking straight at me. "Get out of this house!" Apparently, she was actually tired of the devil wreaking havoc in our home. But at the time, I didn't know that. I thought she wanted me out, so I did. I moved in with my sister, who lived by the beach in Florida. It was so easy to slip back into the drug scene there. I was unhappy and depressed, not doing much of anything. On most nights, I sat out by the water by myself, looking out into the black of night and thinking about what had happened to my life. The steady sounds of the ocean waves were somehow soothing. God, why would you bring me all this way to let me fall all the way into it again? A calm voice rolled in the waves. I didn't bring you anywhere. I'm still right here by your side. You're the one who walked away. Tears poured from my eyes, and I cried and carried on all by myself on that beach. Take me back, I begged God. I'll never let you go. By the time I got up off the sand and brushed off my clothes, I had a different relationship with God. a new understanding of what he expects from us. It had been several months since I'd left Kay Francis for the second time, and I wanted to go home. She let me move back in, saying there was something different about me. And there was a lot different about our lives. While I was gone, Shaylin had gotten pregnant by her girlfriend's brother, and I was about to become a grandfather. This time I stayed out of the drug scene. I had been healed of back pain at a miraculous prayer service in Louisiana, and now I spent my time working and volunteering in the community garden. When people and pastors stopped to talk to me, it felt good that people paid attention to me for something other than drugs. We joined Livingstone's church in 2006, quickly connecting with our pastor PK and his wife Virginia. When that call came at work one morning, it changed everything. I needed our church family more than ever. My teenage granddaughter was screaming so hysterically I could hardly understand her. "Papa, she's dead! She's dead!" Now don't be playing with me like that. Why would my granddaughter call me like this at work? "Papa, she's cold. She won't wake up." I believed her then. I called 911 and drove over to Shaylin's house as fast as I could, where I found two skinny kids crying because they'd lost their mother due to prescribed medications that didn't mix. Shaylin had gone to sleep the night before. She never woke up. I had lost my precious daughter, who I'd loved since I met her on my first date with Kay Francis. We found Shaylin on the sofa with her Bible next to her. She had rededicated her life to Christ just a week before, and she died as a child of God. PK and Virginia, our pastors, stayed with us almost constantly for the next few days as we sorted through our own devastation and the logistics of Shaylin's life. PK is a former Houston police officer, and he arrived at Shaylin's house not long after I did, knowing what questions to ask and how to handle the situation. The church showered us with food, gifts, and cards, treating us better than I've treated people I've known for years and years. It's just amazing that our church family supported us the way they did. The blow of Shaylin's death was followed by another round of troubled times. And for the first few years, the life we had gotten on track was stirred up again like a nest of hornets. The grandkids, Mariah Nicole and her brother Eddie, moved in with us. Kay Francis and I were suddenly parents to two young and undisciplined teenagers. The kids slept in donated bunks in our small guest room, and eventually I added on to my house and built them each their own bedroom. Mariah Nicole's room is decked out in everything cheerleading, and Eddie has a football room. Neither had ever had a room to themselves. The grandkids' rebellious activities were stressful. Previous to Shaylin's death, Mariah Nicole had been in trouble at school for drugs, and soon after, Eddie was hauled out of school for drug involvement as well. Both spent time in juvenile detention. Sam, Shaylin's oldest, had also served time in jail. But this time served as a turning point for each of them, and God ministered and answered prayers. These days, when I move to get out of my chair, Eddie often appears in front of me and grabs my hands. "Let me help you, Papa." And I let him pull me up. If I'm working in the yard, he'll take over, telling me he likes to sweat and wants to do the work. By that time, I may have gotten a whiff of something baking in the kitchen where Mariah Nicole's probably cooking a dessert for me. These two children are now more thankful and take better care of me and Kay Francis than I could have ever imagined. God asked us to take care of these children, and because of our obedience, God has brought peace to our family. Those hornets have flown away.
It always amazes me when a person finds Jesus. It's not just their life that's impacted. No, it's the lives of many generations. Have you ever asked Jesus to come into your life? Do you feel lost and uncertain? Why don't you pray with me right now? The exit door to the maze is right in front of you. Pray with me now, and let's ask Jesus to do His transforming work in your life. Let's pray right now. Dear Jesus, I am so lost. Most of my decisions are based on what feels good at the moment. But I have to admit that I don't really have a good reason for most of my decisions. My life seems aimless, and I need you to come into my life and begin to guide me. I'm weak, but the Bible tells us that you are strong. Jesus, I need a strong Savior. Would you wash my life of all the lies, corruption, and bad decisions? Would you come into me and give me the goodness that only you can bring? Jesus, I want out of the maze. I am inviting you to be the Lord of my life. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for praying with me. And I want to encourage you, stay tuned to this podcast because I think it's going to help you in your new walk with Jesus. Now, you may know someone who really needs to hear this podcast. Would you please send them a link? It could be the very thing they're looking for. Thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday for another true and amazing story on the Unreal Podcast.